Hello, Brubs. We're back with Beer Money. Um, it's a story about Francis Stroh's growing up in the Stroh's Brewing Company or Stroh Brewery in Detroit in the 70s and 80s. And her father was obviously one of the heirs of the original company that began in the 1800s. I believe this is chapter 3. What's it called? There's the house at Grayton Road, 1974 by Eric Stroh. Guess there's no chapter title, it just goes right into it. Our house was full of shiny valuables that we were forbidden to touch. To touch. Rare Martin guitars leaned against upholstered chairbacks. Chairbacks in our living room, as if waiting for cocktails to be delivered. Glossy silver boxes housing monogrammed guitar picks littered the mahogany tabletops. Antique Leica cameras and real guns from the Wild West decorated desktops and bookshelves where leather-bound first editions of Nathaniel Hawthorne commingled with the first edition of Through the Looking Glass signed by Lewis Carroll. On occasion, my father would take out his favorite antique revolver. Is this light on? Yes, it is. A perfect greyhound of a gun with a long barrel and intricate engravings surrounding its ivory inlaid grip, and show me how to clean and oil it. Then he would have me reach my finger around the trigger and pull. Afterward, he'd open it up and show me why it hadn't fired. There were no bullets. See, John Wayne carried this gun and how the West was won. He'd tell me with pride. My father loved old westerns. He sometimes dressed the part, and walked around the house in boots, spurs, and a cowboy hat, flipping the guns out of their holsters like the outlaw Jesse James. He often told the story of dressing up as a cowboy when he was a kid on Christmas Day, and how his mother had shouted at him to change into a jacket and a tie. I never forgave my mother for that, he would say with a faraway look. If my mother came into the room while my father was showing me how to load the bullets, he'd look up at her and beam, God, I love my guns, Gail, more than anything in the world. Those awful guns, that was her habitual reply. How can you love them? And while the two of them dueled it out with their scripted conversation, I enjoyed the privilege of handling the goods. My parents often talked this way. I usually knew that one would say to the other a predictability I found deeply comforting. Nor did it concern me the thought that my father loved his possessions at least as much as he loved us. I took it as a given. But there was a double standard in our house. While I was sometimes allowed to handle my father's treasures, as soon as my younger brother, Whitney, could walk, he was punished just about daily for touching my father's things, spanked, yelled at, and sent to his room. None of us was immune. When I was 4, I wandered into my parents' bathroom and ran my father's razor up my arm to see how it worked. When he found it clogged with hair, he slapped me across the face 3 times until I admitted I'd done it. Bastard. And yet, Whitney had these run ins with my father more than all the rest of us put together. One day, my father left a fragile clay pipe on a table, well within reach of a toddler's wandering hands, and then snapped like a mousetrap when Whitney, of course, broke it. Why the hell did you break my pipe? My father angrily demanded, taking Whitney by the shirt collar. Because I did, said my frightened 3-year-old brother. Then I'm going to spank you, said my father. Why? Asked Whitney. Because I am, that's why. My father and I often went out to a local diner for dinner, just the two of us, while my mother stayed at home to make dinner for the boys. Other times, my father and I played a game that I secretly hated. a game ostensibly designed to teach me a valuable skill: how not to get kidnapped. I still remember the first time he made me play Francis. He shouted from the bottom of the stairs, "Time to practice. Step outside, please." My whole body tensed at the sound of his voice. I could tell from the sour smell of the air around him that he'd been drinking. Because we were a known family, because we had a name that made us stand out, it was very important. My father had told me that I play this game with him. Nothing mattered more than this, not even learning how to swim or how to read or how to hit a tennis ball. I have a narrator. Great. They'll take you away and we'll never see you again, my father said, or they'll ask for a ransom that we can't possibly afford to pay. What's a ransom? I asked. A lot of money, millions of dollars. It seemed a terrible curse to have a recognizable name, but to have a recognizable name and not enough money to pay the ransom, nothing less than a cruel joke. We walked outside. Stand right here, said my father, his brow unaccountably heavy with anger, pointing to a spot on the sidewalk in front of our house, a 6-bedroom Spanish Mediterranean with a sprawling green lawn. This was a serious game, a game that made my father stern, impatient. I assumed my position on the pavement, a surge of dread twisting my insides. The facades of neighbors' houses suddenly became menacing faces, the sound of their gardeners mowing, a barrage of violent sound in my head. No one, it seemed, would be able to save me. I'll go get the car, said my father, walking across the lawn to the driveway. Oh, this fucking camera's messing up. To the driveway to start the car. Then he drove around the block. Sometime during those 2 minutes, while I waited alone for the car to reappear from the opposite end of our street, something magical and mortifying happened. My father's silver Chrysler became someone else's car, the car of a complete stranger. My heart jumped at the sight of the approaching sedan. My abductor's car, as it slowed down upon spotting me, a small blonde girl, 7 years old, with straight cut bangs. "Come here, little girl," a frightening man with my father's face called tauntingly from the car. He held a Hershey's chocolate bar out the window. I burst into tears and ran away just as I had been instructed. Kidnappers, I knew, baited young children with candy. But even as I raced up the front steps of our house, I found no comfort in the familiar. It was the creepy, almost psychotic look on my father's face as he called out to me, pretending to be someone else, that terrified me. "Hello, Bobs!" Charlie sometimes hid me in his room when my father arrived home from work. We'd sit on his bed and look at books about World War II that he'd borrowed from Bobby. Books with pictures of Germans in belted overcoats saluting a man with an Oliver Hardy mustache. "That's Hitler," Charlie would tell me, "the one who killed all the Jews." I had seen a picture of the Jews once, naked together in a room with no windows. Their hollowed out eyes stared right through me, and I'd had nightmares for days afterward. "Let's not look at that book again," I remember telling him, and he hid the book underneath the bed. What's this book? This book is Beer Money by Frances Stroh, about her growing up in the famous family, the Stroh family, which was a brewer in Detroit for 150 years before Democrats ruined the city. I remember telling him, and he hid the book underneath the bed. Then he'd get out the Indian beads, thousands of them, sorted by color, and we'd string necklaces. He'd gently teach me how to tie a knot or combine the beads in a particular pattern, and if my knot didn't work, he never became angry when my beads fell all over the scratchy wool bedspread. Oh no. My opinion? My opinion of what? Jesus loves you and he wants a relationship with you. Jesus is the one true king. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the way. May God bless you and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, buddy. Heed that is, who's the guy? Charlie. Just pick them up one by one and drop them back into the storage box. Sometimes we could hear my father shouting at Bobby or shouting at my mother down in the kitchen, and we'd go on stringing beads as if nothing were happening. Eventually, my father would throw open the door to Charlie's room, and he'd send me downstairs so he could fight it out with the boys. Afraid, I'd go into the living room where my mother was busy reading the book, and we'd silently listen to my father chasing Bobby and Charlie up and down the long hallway upstairs, as if trying to corral a particularly willful herd of cattle. Loud thumps echoed through the floorboards after my father managed to catch my brothers, but my mother never so much as looked up from her novel. It was as if I were experiencing the blows myself, compounded by a terrible sense of helplessness. To distract myself, I'd get out my markers and a sketch pad and draw movie stars. Or Bible scenes I'd studied in Sunday school. I'd spend hours getting the face of Humphrey Bogart or Jesus Christ just right, starring over and over again until the eyes, nose, and mouth were perfect. Starting over again, that is. At school, I was universally known to be the best artist, and at home, I was mostly left alone to do my drawings, an invisible bubble forming around me, blocking out everything happening inside the house. Of the book. What's your opinion on the book? Well, I'm reading it, aren't I? 1 out of 100, I'll give it, right now, at this point, I'll give it a 43.6 objectively, but since it's about Detroit, and I'm from Detroit, I will give it a 63.8. It has interest to me, even though she seems like a melodramatic biatch. Having formed a close friendship in early childhood, Bobby and Charlie spent most of their time together. With Bobby as the leader, when Bobby built a model of the Titanic, Charlie would also build a model of the Titanic, only not as well. One summer evening when they were 8 and 10 years old, Bobby and Charlie jumped on their bikes and rode up to Rose Terrace, the Dodge family lakefront estate, to wait in line for a public viewing of Mrs. Horace Dodge's open casket. Once inside, they filed past her body, and to the shock and dismay of the other spectators, Charlie reached out and pinched the corpse's overly rouged cheek while Bobby giggled approvingly. Charlie struggled with his schoolwork, often having to retake tests, catch up on reading, and endlessly practice word pronunciation with my mother. And yet, he was a favorite among his teachers. In hushed voices, my parents sometimes referred to him as slow, but he never received any educational testing or special attention at school. My parents' expectations were simply lower for him than for Bobby, and they deemed Charlie's approval seeking behaviors as natural for a child with his lesser intelligence. My father's nickname of Chaz for Charlie and Nitwit for Whitney made his allegiances clear among his sons. Bobby was the crown prince. He laughed at Bobby's jokes, encouraged his rare beer can collecting, and praised his term papers. Charlie could only trail in Bobby's shadow, awkwardly, adopting his hobbies and witticisms. The gentler of the two older boys and the lesser student, Charlie suffered the brunt of my father's unpredictable moods, absorbing his scathing criticism and bullying until he escaped to the relative safety of boarding school. As for my mother's oblivion to our problems, this was contrived, she later told us, to protect. If I had intervened, Dad would only have been that much harder on all of you. The youngest of 3 brothers, my father was known as an eccentric boy who would sit on the street curb smoking cigars and mouthing off to kids who passed by. He'd spend his afternoons alone watching nickel Laurel and Hardy movies at the Punch and Judy Theater, then go home to shower and change into a coat and tie for dinner. When he arrived, his much older brothers, Gary and Peter, or is it Gary, would be sitting in the living room with their mother as she sipped her cocktail, awaiting their father's arrival from the brewery, while the cook prepared the usual four-course dinner in the kitchen. No one ever took much notice of my father as he came into the room, save for when the Bro cream he used in his hair rubbed off on the sofa upholstery, and his mother would shout, "Get off that sofa, you little pest." His father, Gary Stroh, who ran the brewery, was forever preoccupied with problems at work, particularly during World War II when hops and wheat were being rationed. He refused to water down the family beer, thereby sacrificing quality of taste, as the other U.S. brewers had done to keep volumes up. A man of principle, he also had a fierce temper, and my father really talked about him. I was intimidated by my father, he once told me, and avoided him at best as best I could. My grandfather's sternness may have stemmed in part from his guilt over a terrible injury he'd caused his younger brother John when they were children. One July afternoon, the two boys played in the garden of their Italianate. I don't know how to say that. I've seen it come up in different books and I still haven't learned it. Italianate? I think it was Italianate. Mansion on the Detroit River, taking turns at target practice with the new archery set while their nannies took tea in the shade of the terrace. Julius, their father, was holding court at a brewery board meeting. Hetty, their mother, was taking a nap. Oops, I'm on the wrong page showing. Was taking a nap before dinner. My grandfather loaded the bow, testing its flexibility while 8-year-old Uncle John disappeared behind the tree to fetch the stray arrows. Gary aimed at the target, but his finger slipped and the arrow shot sideways, bouncing off a tree's trunk and piercing young John's right eye. God damn. The bloody scene that followed, combined with the wrath of Julius, became as legendary as it had been traumatic. For the remainder of his life, John wore a glass eye in his right socket, while Gary wore a sheath of self-recrimination. That's pretty awful, buddy. My father mostly went unnoticed as a child. When he wasn't alone at the movies, he spent his time with a nanny, while his mother and her sister, Louise, enjoyed martini lunches at the country club. His parents, however, still tried to exert control over his activities. My father loved country and bluegrass music, for instance, but was forbidden by his parents to listen to hillbilly music at home. At least the driver who brought him to school allowed my father to play country music in the car. Photography, my father's second great passion, was discouraged as well. After being accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design at age 18, my father sought his mother's advice. "If you go there," she told him, "I'll always feel ashamed. Can't you find another college?" Susie, she insisted her grandchildren call her Susie, so as not to feel old, had never overcome the embarrassment she felt growing up in the midst of Philadelphia society as the daughter of an artist. Her father, my great-grandfather Nunk, a kind-natured antique dealer and hobbyist, sketch artist, often painted the furniture in his shop with early American floral motifs. Susie had always aspired to more, to wealth, glamour, social position. In spite of the shame she felt over her father's vocation, Susie was Nunk's favorite daughter, not to mention his most beautiful. With her chiseled features and slim figure, she was the daughter for whom he waited up at night with sandwiches and hot chocolate when she arrived home from parties. When the family could afford only one new dress, the other daughters, Louise and Barry, or is it Betty? Betty, were inevitably passed over in favor of Susie. One weekend at a friend's country house, Susie met the somber and serious Gary Stroh, Jesus Christ, son of the renowned brewer Julius. Susie's liveliness and beauty captured Gary's attention, and the two were married within a year. 9 years later, Gary's younger brother John married Susie's younger sister Louise. No longer did anyone need to fret over who got the new dress. Turning down his acceptance to the Rhode Island School of Design, my father attended Michigan State College instead, dropped out after 2 years, and then, following a stint in the Army, joined the family business. Photography for the remainder of his life was relegated to a hobby, while each morning he grudgingly put on a suit and drove to Detroit to the brewing company his family had owned and operated for 4 generations. One summer evening, my cousins Pierre and Freddie came over with their parents, my uncle Peter and Aunt Nicole. Pierre and I were best friends, born only 10 days apart. Freddie was 2 years younger. We sat in the fading sunlight on the terrace, breathing in a garden bursting with bloom and the raw scent of freshly cut grass, and drank Werner's ginger ale, while the grown-ups had cocktails and argued about the brewery. Unlike my parents, Aunt Nicole and Uncle Peter never argued when I was at their house, where I spent many a weekend in the summers, so I knew it must have been my father who started the fight. Pierre and I giggled uncomfortably every time his father made my father raise his voice. We didn't understand what they were talking about, but we knew his father would always win the argument. Times are changing, Eric, Uncle Peter gently instructed my father. We have to grow, have to get bigger to compete, or we'll continue to lose market share and volume. God bless me. My father frowned through a cloud of cigarette smoke. How big? He asked his older brother, his striped dress shirt dampening under the arms. Oh, comes another sneeze. Motherfucker. Uncle Peter had once had plans to join the CIA, but he had been run over by a truck and nearly crippled, ruining his chances. Now, walking with a slight limp, he ran the brewery alongside my great uncle John, who, after Gary died, watered down the beer formula to suit the post World War II American preference for milder beer. After that, the company had grown rapidly, acquiring its number one competitor in Michigan, the Goebel Brewing Company. As big as we can get, Uncle Peter replied, his jaw set. Stroh's and Goebel alone aren't enough. We have to keep acquiring other brands, other breweries. We need national recognition, Eric, said Aunt Nicole in her French accent, her chin-length blonde hair pulled back with tortoise-shell combs. She was always chic and sophisticated like that. A town and country magazine cover come to life. Our housekeeper, Ollie, and my mother arrived from the kitchen with a hot cheese dip and a platter of Triscuits, and Ollie put the dip down on the table with an oven glove. It was hardly like at Aunt Nicole and Uncle Peter's house, far grander than ours, where servants brought out French cheeses, bowls of olives, and delicious sliced tomatoes from their garden, drizzled with olive oil. Thank you, Ollie, said Uncle Peter. He always stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes and talked with Ollie whenever he came over to the house, asking after her family. Mr. Peter Stroh is such a nice man, Ollie always said after he'd left, and my father wouldn't say anything. But he was a good man. Once, after a golfing accident in his garden, when a driver swung into my head, Uncle Peter had driven me to the hospital. All the way to the emergency room, he'd held my hand as I bled into a linen towel. You're going to be okay, Franny, he said over and over, his small eyes dewy and bloodshot, and I could see how shaken he was. The leaf-dappled light had drifted from the terrace to the lawn while the grown-ups talked, and the mosquitoes were starting to nip at my ankles. Finally, my father stood up from the table in a fit of frustration. And where the hell are we going to get the money for all this growth? Our volumes are already starting to decline. Exactly, said Aunt Nicole. The competition is gaining ground. We can't defend our position in the Midwest anymore. She crossed her bone thin legs, her gold sandals, offsetting her tan to perfection. We'll have to grow or go, said Uncle Peter with finality. We'll borrow the money. Everyone fell silent. I didn't know what grow or go meant, but I understood that the company was in trouble, and I felt afraid. Even Pierre had stopped laughing. The acid smell of the hot cheese dip hung on the air. My father walked away, defeated and angry, like the champion runner I'd seen on TV, who'd gotten second place in the Moscow Olympics. He walked the garden circuit, taking quick drags on his cigarette, absently checking the sprinkler heads. He never liked to sit with any group of people for very long, especially after an argument, and I had that sinking feeling I so often got when my father was unhappy. The evening continued without him, the sun setting behind the trees in bursts of pink and orange, ice clinking in people's glasses as the rest of the grown ups managed to talk on amiably enough. Taking my picture was one of the few things in life that made my father happy. He'd get me to pose against the textured bark of a tree or the long grass in a field, zooming in close with his vintage Leica, his cigarette dangling as he barked out art direction. Relax your hand on your knee. That's right. Now on the count of three, invariably, he'd snap the shutter on the count of two. Once he'd photographed me in our garden just before a party. I stood beneath a towering oak tree, its gloriously gnarled roots dwarfing my tiny feet. I remembered how my feet ached gripping those roots as I crouched down for the shot. This time, give me a smile, my father said. I shifted my weight onto my other leg, my back scraping against the tree. Ow, I whined. My father stood and stamped out his cigarette on the perfectly manicured grass. Sometimes I'd see the gardeners picking up cigarette butts on their way to the flower beds. I tried to stand up. Stay there, my father commanded. Just a few more. He breathed heavily as he looked through the viewfinder. He always tried several angles, smiling at me between each one, while my shins throbbed and my feet went numb. I remember wondering if one day I would also learn to use a complicated camera like his Leica. Like my father, I wanted to freeze people in time, as if by doing so I might come to understand them better. Francis, my father said then affectionately, you look marvelous. I smiled for the shot and he clicked the shutter. My father's photographs were widely recognized as the best in Grosse Pointe. An amateur with little training, he shot the portraits that my parents' friends sent out in their Christmas cards and framed on their living room side tables, portraits that in years to come their children would take into their more modest houses as keepsakes of an all but bygone era of lakefront estates, Lily Pulitzer dresses, and big, strapping American cars. Money was everything in Grosse Pointe. You couldn't live there if you didn't have it, and some had a lot more than others. The social hierarchy favored the richest, oldest families who had settled in the area and built Detroit from the ground up. Thriller books from Joel Rosenberg are really an awesome read. Great. The same families who lived on my street, whose children attended my private school, and who swam at my club. These were my childhood friends, progeny of the Fords, the Fruhoffs, the Chryslers, and despite the age old taboo, my friends sometimes discuss their family's wealth. We have $60 million, Allison Goodyear announced poolside at the club one day. In my 9-year-old mind, I tried to picture 60 million. Piles of stacked bills as tall and as wide as Goodyear's enormous house. I was already aware that if you were rich, you could be as bad as you wanted and get away with it. My parents lately had been gossiping about Allison's parents, who were getting a divorce, and about the many boyfriends her mother had been spotted driving around in her new Jaguar. convertible. I never saw Allison's parents when I had sleepovers at her house. We were attended instead by a multitude of nannies and housekeepers. The parents, I imagined, were off pirouetting from the wrecks of sleek sports cars, martini glasses still in hand. When I told my mother about Allison's pile of money, she sighed woefully. That is simply terrible, she said. Children should not be talking about money. But money was a part of one's identity. If you lost it, you lost yourself. Or so it seemed to me, and throughout my young life, I was keenly aware that this is just what we were doing, losing ourselves. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. As the saying goes, even as children surrounded by so much abundance, we had been warned there wouldn't be enough to last. One day the money will go, my mother often told my brothers and me, especially if Dad continues to spend this way. Her warnings encroached like a black cloud on an otherwise lovely day, and the fear of having nothing took hold deep within each of us. Where would we go? How would we live? Having nothing seemed as inconceivable as not existing, and the two became inextricably linked in my consciousness. This constant sense of scarcity, a fear of impoverishment that had been part of our DNA before it became a self fulfilling prophecy, was a feeling against which my father rebelled with cocktails and even more aggressive spending sprees. One afternoon, we came home from swimming at the club to the surprising sight of my father sitting behind the wheel of a new Cadillac Seville parked in the driveway. Standing there with one hand on the gleaming silver hood, he waved us out of my mother's station wagon. He opened the doors and had us smell the rich, red leather seats and try the fancy electric windows and the air conditioning. 3-year-old Whitney, I remember, smudged the glass, and my father barked at him to go inside the house and wash his hands. I felt a sharp pang of guilt as he slunk off. Come over here, Franny, my father said. I want to show you something. He popped an 8-track tape in a slot in the dash, and suddenly Benny Goodman's jazz filled the plush interior of the car. My heart swelled as I inhaled the new car's smell. I was flying high on abundance and on my father's glorious mood, all the more so because, of course, I knew it wouldn't last. My mother frowned and went inside. Ollie peered out from behind the curtain. She did her best to protect all of us from my father. Often, after crying and begging her on a Friday, Whitney would ride with Ollie on the bus to spend the weekend in her house in Detroit. At the intersection of 7 Mile and Livernois, near to where the riots had erupted and where the sound of gunfire outside still blended unremarkably with the general hum of traffic. Even as a toddler, Whitney was a survivor. And certainly, being cooped up with my father for an entire weekend, my mother off doing volunteer work, or playing tennis promised the roller coaster ride of unpredictable and treacherous mood swings more threatening than the odd gunshot nearby. But now, enveloped in the luxury of my father's new Cadillac, I was happy. My father turned the key in the ignition and began to back out of the driveway just as Whitney was coming out of the house, his little hands dripping wet. Want to go for a ride? Asked my father as he turned onto our street, Grayton Road, and began to drive away. I looked back and saw Whitney's expression shift from bright expectation to confusion. Clearly, he would not be joining us. My mother pulled him back into the house. My father's love of cars, photography, and collecting was matched only by his love of movies. Horror films were his favorite, and he took me to see them all, including Night of the Living Dead. Within a few years of its release in 1968, he would routinely screen 35mm films in our living room, too, inviting guests for Sunday afternoon movie binges that often included the Italian horror classic Suspiria, preceded by, say, Laurel and Hardy shorts. We kids would crunch our butter-drenched popcorn, thoroughly absorbed in this or that bloody scene, while the adults sipped cocktails The sweet smell of gin, our frail link to the relative safety of the off screen world, and all the while my father would be standing by the projector, glowing with happiness as Halloween or Dawn of the Dead unfurled on the screen. I both loved and loathed horror films. The suspenseful music, the false sense of happenstance, the way two girls would get separated in the forest, guaranteeing their graphic slaughter, it all left me feeling by turns helpless and elated, danger becoming fused with excitement in my young nervous system. There's little off. Oh, that's Gail Robertson. Sorry. Hey, hi. What's this chapter called? No chapter. Let's see how many pages are in this little chapter. Because I'm not going to read it. It's going to be too long. I'm already getting tired. F this. Alright, that's all for now, Pops. Beer money.